Hello and welcome to my comments on your Google Hangout 3, the discussion between Todd, Maria, and Aaron. And I am reminding you this was the one on toxic leadership and incivility in the workplace and addressing those critical issues. So I'm going to start by saying that I really enjoyed your discussion, and you all showed the evidence of preparation and doing the readings and reflection and positioning yourself with respect to those questions. So I enjoyed your session. And so I'm going to start with question you addressed first, question number 1, and on 3 criteria that Reed gives in his video on toxic leadership. The lack of regards to others, being driven by self-interest, and the negative impact the leader has on the overall organizational climate. And Todd started the discussion on that nuke fam individual that was mentioned in a video, and how he did not clearly fall along the 3 characteristics of a toxic leader, because he mainly displayed the personality traits of a human blowtorch, of being impulsive and abrupt and directive with his subordinates, but he was motivated by the overall mission and not motivated by the self-interest. So you collectively agreed that maybe he wasn't as bad or as toxic as the requirements that were put forth in that classification by Reed. But you did have, and you had an interesting discussion there. Maria, I think, teased out that in a situation with a nuke them individual, he had to work with people that were otherwise unmotivated, apathetic, and needed a directive style, even though generally most of the people in the unit, they did the work, but they were not particularly crazy to work for him. And so Todd took it a little bit further and talked about his experiences in his line of work, where particularly in events of high unpredictability, so let's say special security events that he performed for the Bushes and the Clintons, and when Hillary was visiting in his area, they had to rely on many moving pieces to the security detail, and those plans could have changed on a minute's notice, and they were not known to them. So they had to adjust very quickly. And in those situations, a lot of times the orders or commands, or you don't look for rationale, and there is no time to have the committee meeting on that and seek consensus. You just basically follow the orders. And so you brought that to those critical events in Homeland Security emergency management, where that type of leadership style, sometimes it's tolerated because of context and of conditions of work. And I have to agree with you here that certainly it is very hard to deal with unmotivated people, and B, you do have those dynamic, unpredictable events where sometimes there is not a whole lot of time to ask opinions of others or, check if they agree, and you just push through. You are that human blowtorch because you need to accomplish something in a short period of time with many moving pieces. Yet I propose to you that, on the axis, Maria had a presentation in theories of leadership. Maria, and I believe it was you, Maria, that had a situational, Hersey and Blanchard situational leadership theory coverage. And in situational leadership theory, you have 2 axes. One is motivation, one is experience. So you can have employees that display low level of experience and high level of motivation. And with those employees, you probably do not want to be directive. You want to be more nurturing and coaching. So you don't want to be a bully with people that are motivated. And then you can have those that are not very experienced and not very motivated. And that's this lack motivation comes in here, where you need more of the authoritarian and directive leadership style. However, if you have somebody that's extremely experienced and not motivated, then the directive decision-making style will not work. And that's, you know, the core of this situational leadership theory. With experienced, unmotivated individuals, there has been something that happened along the way in their work that made them not want to do what they are doing. And if you direct them, then of course you don't have the buy-in and you don't have their support. They're just going to be even more, you know, they're going to recoil and not really look up to the leader. So the leadership style with people that are unmotivated is to actually get to the core reasons, what's going on with their performance. And that's a big art of getting to those seasoned, experienced professionals that sort of lost the vision along the way. And that requires more of a participative decision-making, participative leadership. You sort things out with them and you sort them out together because, you know, they have that big acumen of experience. And then, of course, you have those last quadrant where you have highly motivated people that are highly experienced. And that's where you do not use directive decision-making or leadership style. You do not use coaching. They don't need it, their experience. This is where the laissez-faire, or the French for let be, comes in. And in organizations, that laissez-faire really truly applies only to those individuals. That's the only effective, that laissez-faire style is effective with that group. So when I think about organizations, a laissez-faire style would be with a professor with 20 or 30 years of experience who is extremely productive as a subject matter expert, and they do not need the chair to check on them what they're doing, or if they're in the office, or, you know, because they are perfectly capable of managing their work. And or let's say you have scientists that are working on some, Nobel Prize research. And certainly you don't need administration of the university or something to be checking on them. You have seasoned commanders who know exactly what they're doing, and especially if they're motivated. You probably don't need to sit over their shoulder and look at every step that they are making or every plan that they are building. So you let them be. And that's, you know, that's sort of, I want you to think in that framework of situational leadership, because, and Todd, I think you alluded to that in your discussion, that sometimes it's going to depend. So, but directive leadership, authoritarian leadership, like the NUCFAM, will work with unmotivated people without experience, or, you know, if you can't motivate those people, you just need to let them go. So, I thought you had a really interesting discussion around those topics here. You know, I do not, I understand those issues that Todd talked about, that sometimes, you know, you just need to get bullied to get to the next step. But you can work in fast-paced environments and make critical decisions and lead people according to what I call the 3 C's, which is cool, composed, and compassionate. So, it doesn't mean that if there is a crisis, you know, the leader has to run around and bark orders. They could be composed, they could be cool, and then they could be at the same time understanding or compassionate and aware of the issues. That's a big difference also in my mind between a manager and the leader. The manager needs to make sure that the right things are getting done at the right time. And the leader really is trying to make things right? So finding the right way towards the vision. So sometimes a good manager is also a good leader, but sometimes a good manager is not necessarily a good leader. And perhaps that's, you know, a case with NUCFAM, if we are making those arguments from the Reed's video. So question number 2, you moved on to look at those indicators of toxicity and the impact on people, on organizations. And you discussed, I think Todd was talking about self-esteem, integrity, the morale. If you are a toxic leader, that affects the overall morale of the entire team and the fellowship. Social exclusion creates divisiveness, and I think you've mentioned work cliques and infractions, and how people get fractured along those lines, along affinities, and so some people get excluded. I think, Maria, you mentioned an example from your internship where you have noticed the social exclusion of somebody that just had a different personality in a workplace, and what it did to you. It made you question whether you could trust those people or if they talked behind your back as well. So you can see how the social exclusion will percolate to other aspects, such as trust in the people in the organization. So the toxic behaviors are contagious, and they could put into question how you feel about the workplace, how you feel about those people. If they can isolate one person, if they can exclude that individual, where do you position yourself in that? Can you fully trust them? And of course, Todd took it back to mission critical areas, hurricanes, active shooters, the main objective being saving lives. And yet, even within those, and I would argue particularly because in Homeland Security and emergency management, you do work with uncertainty. So when the uncertainty is high, then you are in a hypervigilant state in that crisis. So it's therefore even more important that those organizations during regular workday, when you are moving through your police department, or somebody working when there is no hurricane or natural disaster and they're working in the office, that climate is positive, because you already go through those peaks of high performance in those moments of stress. And therefore you need that, compassionate platform in the times in between. You discussed the ostracism, you discussed fun, fellowship, loyalty, citizenship, all those things that take a hit when you have a toxic leadership. Increase in cynicism. I think you had a really good discussion here. Maria sorted out and captured the essence of cynicism. When it's very hard to accept praise or accept somebody's objectives, because you're looking for underlying meaning there. If you have a toxic leader and they praise you, then you start getting worried. Are they, is there another agenda behind that? Or, are they truly praising me? So the trust also erodes. Now, among all those factors, Reid discussed that retention of employees and suicide have not been empirically linked to toxicity in the workplace. But, intuitively, we probably agree that when we are in a toxic environment and we have an opportunity to change jobs, we probably will look for greener pastures. And turnover is very expensive for organizations, because there is cost of training, there is cost of human resources, there is cost of licensing and uniforms, and, you name it, you invest in those employees when you hire them. So when you lose them to the greener pastures because you have a toxic climate, you're not leading that organization effectively as far as efficiency is concerned. So money, remember we had this discussion between efficiency and effectiveness. They are not always identical. But here, if you have eroded morale, if you don't have fellowship, if people don't have fun at work, and then you also losing money, you're both ineffective and inefficient. Right. And, I think Todd mentioned the Magic Johnson and the fact that he was, really extremely inspirational, but it's not enough to be inspirational, to actually be a good leader. And leadership, that goes back to arguments on whether leadership is a born trait, whether you're born with it or whether you nurture it. And most of the research today supports the idea that leaders are developed, that they are not born, that they are made, that you actually provide professional development, that you provide them with insight, with assessments, and the people that you put in managerial positions, they should be developed to be leaders as well. The next question, and something that I want to bring up as well, that comes a lot in Homeland Security and emergency management, that values experience. Homeland Security emergency management is the core of the field, consists of those seasoned practitioners, and so the experience is extremely valued. But I, and I think you would agree with me, you would argue that experience is not always the equivalent of competence. And just because somebody has 20 years doing something in the field doesn't mean that they are doing it in the best way, that they are doing it the most effectively, just because they have been there for that long, right? And you later had, Todd, I think you mentioned that as well in your discussion. You had then you had a question, which one of the toxic characteristics and theories in your view is the most detrimental and why? And so you explored the 6 theories or 6 strands of toxic leadership. And, you know, I think that most of you agree that the bullying type is not optimal and not ideal, but that bullying, well, most of you, because Maria didn't really get on the wagon with you. So Todd and Aaron, you were saying, well, you know, again, going back to those fast-paced events, if you get bullied or barked at or berated in a moment of the critical decision being made, you can develop a thick skin, or you can bypass it if you know that the leader is well-intentioned and that it goes for the mission and towards the mission. Whereas laissez-faire could be actually worse. And Maria said that, you know, she doesn't want to be bullied in the workplace, so she prefers the laissez-faire, where she's left alone. And, you know, even though the person is not engaged in her development, but at least she's not yelled at, for example. And I think that it's very important to make that distinction here, that laissez-faire, you know, it seems on that list the least detrimental, because it is not kicking people, it is not berating people, it is not undermining their sense of worth at the moment. It's sort of, you know, more unattached and, you know, not very interested. But I'll propose this to you. And that goes with my discussion to Todd and Aaron. When you are working in Homeland Security and emergency management, in any organization really, behaviors like use of force by supervisors, bullying, coercion, most of those behaviors today are regulated by policy. And even though they perhaps were tolerated by my generation, by the generation before me, you know, sexual harassment was rampant when I was younger. And you almost develop a thick skin to that, because you had to sort of throw it into the equation of just focusing on your work and not paying attention to it and learning how to cope with it. But today, those type of behaviors are not acceptable in most of the workplaces. So harassment, sexual harassment, destructive behaviors, throwing things at people, berating people overtly, you can pretty much follow a legal recourse to those. So they're not good. When you look at those, they seem really clearly toxic, where laissez-faire seems to be, you know, a little bit more benign. but it's the laissez-faire that is very difficult to combat, because you don't have a whole lot of policies against that, because there are no laws about, a non-caring employer or supervisor. It's very hard to document that or video it, as Todd said, we've got cameras, we can document, we can report those really horrible, harassing statements that people make. But how do you record when, somebody doesn't care or doesn't value your input? And I would propose to you that laissez-faire is extremely toxic, because it's pervasive, because it's insidious, and because it's invisible, or it's very hard to operationalize. It's very hard to count. It's very hard to put into a term where you can actually do something about it. And I had bullies as bosses in my life, and I had a boss that was laissez-faire. And I will tell you that when I had a laissez-faire boss, that was the time that I nearly quit my job, because it was extremely devastating. I think, Aaron, you mentioned later in your discussion that when you have a boss that does not discipline other employees when they come in late, that does not, that closes an eye to things that go on that other people are unhappy about, that is a chronic behavior that causes low morale in the organization. And yet, what are you going to do for a boss like that? You're going to go and say, well, he's too lenient or too nice to people or too forgiving. And if you think about some research, for example, in procedural justice, studies have found that, if people go and get a ticket and they're supposed to go to court, and if their case is dismissed and they're not showing up at all, versus the ones that had a case heard by the judge and then the decision was made whether they were guilty or not, those people were much happier because they got the process, versus the people that, just things got dismissed. So, it's sort of a linkage here. I think we can find the parallels. We like to have that feedback. We like to have that, norm being enforced equally for everybody. If I come to work on time and you want to institute a practice of being punctual, being there, and being engaged, then if somebody is not adhering to it and the supervisors are not doing anything about that, they are abdicating for what they're paid for. Right? They are abdicating their responsibility because they are either poorly equipped to deal with it, they don't know how to resolve conflict, or they just simply don't want to bother. So now, going back to our situation with a critical event that Todd was talking about, and let's say you have to do something and somebody yells at you in crisis when the life is, high-risk situations. Yes, you can later address it. You can make a grievance, you can file it, you can, in after action review or debriefing, you say, I do not appreciate being treated this way. You can be assertive, you can take a stand on that. But if in a moment of crisis, your view, your innovative approach, your good solution to the problem is not being heeded at all and lives are lost in the process, those consequences are detrimental to everybody and you can't take them back. So in a way, as bad as mobbing, bullying behaviors, aggressive behaviors, directive or authoritarian styles are repulsive at the first glance, I think that we have to look at laissez-faire as equally understudied, certainly in research, understudied topic. And I think it could be more chronic and it could cause people more of that latent stress. And again, if you're talking about having fun at work, you would want, and if you're a new professional that enters the workforce, you need a lot of mentoring. You need a lot of support. You need a lot of development. That's what the leaders are supposed to do. So if they're detached and they don't care, then, you are not being developed. You don't reach your full potential. So what is worse, getting a reprimand every now and then being able to address it, because it's important to keep in mind too that a lot of those bullying behaviors, the people that do them are not very aware of them. And I think Maria later was discussing this about the leader who wants to improve on their ability to record themselves and watch and sort of, reflect on their behaviors. A very big part of leadership development is to actually watch yourself, because a lot of them don't realize, they're very reactive. They are working in the moment. They don't do a very good impulse control. And impulse control is, a really big factor of developing your leadership. So I thought you had a really, really nice discussion around this. But as you move on to your careers, as you becoming supervisors and leaders, I think that you have to make sure that you don't become disenchanted, retired in place. This is what we call the laissez-faire people. They're retired in place. They really, just doing time till, the next promotion or the next place where they're going to go to. And this can really affect us in the long run as far as our career progression. So where do you want to be when you lead people? How are you going to observe those behaviors in yourself? All right, so the next question was on narratives of toxic leaders. And here you had to come up with different situations or context from your work and your experiences, what you have observed. And so Marie, this is when Marie mentioned the social isolation of a person during her internship, just because they were different. I had a similar discussion in one of the other groups where a person who is an introvert, which is a person that draws energy differently than extrovert. And if people do good leadership assessments, they would gauge that in a workplace. They would use tools such as Myers-Briggs questionnaire to identify who is an introvert in a workplace, who is an extrovert, and how to highlight the best qualities of both, because you need both in a workplace. But somebody who's not very well aware of those different types of personalities is likely to berate an introvert for being aloof or not engaged or not involved, where in reality, they just have different preferences for processing information, for analyzing it first, thinking through the issues. They are much slower to judge, much slower to act, because they need a lot more reflection. Extroverts are, just out there, and they need people to think and to help them formulate their ideas. They need the noise. They need that type of external stimulus, where introverts don't. So that's really important to diagnose. So if you have an individual that's different, it might be an introvert or it might be a loner or whatever, it's it's important to know what they bring to the organization, not ostracize them. I think Todd talked about a whole slew of those narratives in your work. And of course, some of them are the usual suspects. So the managers and employers or your supervisors who take credit for your work, really awful. And that really, in Homeland Security and emergency management environments, it's rampant. And because there is the chain of command. So when there is a chain of command, there's not much you can do. If you have a project or if you have a great idea, you've got to take it to your next level boss, right? And then that next level boss will take it to the next level boss. So in highly hierarchical structures, it's very hard to have a recourse to somebody saying, well, I just came up with that. Because you're not going to go straight to the chief and say, no, this is my work, because this is not how those organizations work. Whereas in other fields, let's say in education, in academia where I am, if somebody steals your idea, that's intellectual theft. If somebody takes your idea that you are researching and uses it and doesn't cite or, develops their own, takes it, then that's a huge legal issue. So it's, depending on different organizations, there's credit for your work, but credit for the work is taking credit for somebody else's work is it's a toxic narrative, right? Going back on your word, that usually happens when the leaders and supervisors do not reflect and do not think strategically. Usually it is not because they lack integrity, and it's not because they are liars. It's generally because they do not allow time for strategically plan something and evaluate whether it's feasible or not. So that promotion, right? They need something done now. They need to throw you a bone. So they're going to tell you they'll work on it, but they truly did not assess the organization and opportunities in the organization and the pros and cons. And, you do not promise something. It's better to under-promise and over-deliver, right? If you've ever heard it, then, over-promise and under-deliver. And poor leaders, weak leaders, will act on impulse and will not think strategically, thinking short term. And thinking short term, sometimes they are making commitments that they cannot later fulfill. And what are they going to do? The only thing they can do is, if they are good, honest people, they will tell you, I'm sorry, but I can't do that for you. But that erodes the feeling of trust and being vested in the organization, and it makes us disappointed. And disappointment goes into resentment. The resentment festers, and then you need a lot of emotional agility to solve those issues, right? So some of the situation that you described with breaking the rules as a rookie, well, I think that's an issue, Todd, with a lot of field trainings. Not being necessarily the best the best run. I see cases all the time of disciplinary issues of employees, of police officers who have big disciplinary problems after they've been signed off from the FTO as being ready for work. But they really, truly, the FTOs were either negligent or laissez-faire, and let them get through certain things. And, then this is a problem employee, because during an FTO, certain things were not instilled or, taught. And the other aspect of it is that a lot of FTOs shouldn't be FTOs, right? And they do things that are not by the book because they already have been in an agency for a long time, and they know where the discretion is and how they can use discretion. The new employees don't know the discretion, especially in policing in the United States. You have a lot of discretion at the lowest level, right? You do not have to give that ticket for that XYZ. You can make the judicious decision. But the new recruit doesn't know that, because they get out of the academy, they get out of the books where they read the codes and they read the procedures and stuff like that, and they want to implement what they learned to the T. Whereas the FTOs, highly experienced with the years and years and years, have a different perspective on it. And they don't really coach the employee through this whole discretion process. So then you can have that conflict. And I think it's a big issue. I think that there should be a very big balance of slowly indoctrinating an employee into the workplace, to where you first support all the rules and all the education that they have gotten. And then over time, you incrementally illuminate the way, right? So you felt very uncomfortable. You felt like you had the conflict between the book and the street and what they were telling you to do, and the fact that, there was maybe some preferential treatment because a female was XYZ, never had a record, and your sense of justice was violated, but you did not know that whole culture of the organization and how it works and stuff like that. So again, I think that a lot of times the FTO programs are really damaging the young employees by showing them the ropes way too early before they can make those decisions themselves and have the ability to make the judgment based on their own experience. and and hopefully that's something that is a good topic for research too. How what are the FTO programs, how are they run, and why are so many employees passing those FTO programs, and then there are problems with them. And a lot of it is because of shortcuts that FTOs take, and sort of not really taking into account the immaturity of the new employee that needs to be acculturated to that culture slowly and with the proper rationale and logic, so they don't think that there is something wrong going on, because then their sense of ethics is violated. And this, yeah, I agree with you that there is no reason today in any, even in military drills and stuff like that, there is no reason to yell at people. And I think your generation basically does not accept that anymore. It is I would be very I find it hard to believe that new recruits that are coming in will tolerate well being yelled at. It's not a norm anymore in a workplace, and policing organizations are changing as well because they have to. Social exclusion, I already discussed. Long hours. This is city gave comp time, and you worked really long hours, and you were short-staffed. And this is a really good discussion on knowing that balance, right? You can only be at peak performance for that long without recovery. And recovery, not that recovery that we're talking about in disasters, but your personal well-being recovery is very important to employees. So I see in some of the policing organizations, there are now wellness programs, health wellness programs. When I was with the Bureau, we were able, now of course it's a federal service, law enforcement service, and we were given 2 hours a day to work out. So so obviously you could there is a problem with it organizationally too, because you usually had so many cases to work that if you were trying to take your 66E to work out, you were told, well, you better put that you're working a tourist case, because we have nobody wants to see that you're working out, because that means that we have time, and if we have time, that we're not going to get another assignment to the unit. So those are issues in organizations. But again, at least we had that policy that you could work out during work hours. So some other ways to recuperate if you are working because we're working 10-hour days. And so obviously nothing like what you were describing, Todd, on some assignments or activations, or when you are going into the mode of natural disaster or something, but people are not productive after a while. So so the important thing is, when you put your people through this very strenuous period of long shifts and stuff, what do you do later? Do you have some kind of recognition program? Do you have some type of, can you park your car, an employee of the month who spent that many hours working overtime? Do you get to have a celebration of some sort? Do you get a retreat? Do you have retreats in your workplace? It's harder to do with big organizations that have, so many employees as Dallas PD has. A little bit easier in smaller organizations, but do you have them? When I discussed Harvey with many of the first responders, they described that they developed what they called as Harvey brain. They couldn't remember days, everything ran together. They did not remember the first week. They didn't know if they ate. They didn't know how they drove home. If they drove home, they forgot things that they did. They didn't remember they called their mothers and stuff like that, because you do get to that. If you don't have recovery, you get to burnout. The good leader is going to be able to diagnose those and know that, yes, there is a time where you have to truly rally and do the mission, then there should be the time for fun, for recognition, for value, for, doing at a boy, at a girl at the end of it. And so I thought you had a really nice discussion there. And then, of course, you got back to the things of, if it ain't broken, don't fix it, and laissez-faire, and let it be. Whereas lack of adaptability to change and lack of adaptability to new ideas. I predict that your generation and this generation that's just now entering the colleges and soon will be in the workforce, your careers are going to be different. They're going to be faster. The promotional scales are going to be, in a shorter periods of time. So, those, the leaders or future leaders would have to be very cognizant of expectations that change in innovation and technology and stuff requires also adaptability and not doing the things the way they've always been done, which I hear I hear that argument quite often from the millennials and the generation after you. Promoting inequity. Aaron was talking about his experiences in a band in school, and certainly, that is very hurtful to be excluded, to be for somebody else to be selected based on, affinity, playing favorites and stuff like that. It's human nature. We gravitate towards some people versus others, but that's again a difference between a toxic and fair and good leader is to try to be as impartial as they can be, try to reward the merit rather than their likes or dislikes. So objectivity, in a way. So with that, you went into some strategies how to deal with toxicity in the workplace and how to deal with your sense of low morale or stress or issues, or how do you address it? And you talked specifically about emotional agility, which goes to the whole topic we've discussed this semester about emotional intelligence, with the first step being to discuss the patterns, see the patterns, name and acknowledge them, and reflect on them. And this is, I think you all agreed that this is a really good framework to be analyzing your work and your performance, that particularly in those very fast-paced environments, crisis situations, going from call to call, being responsive, you have a stimulus and you act. You have a stimulus and you act. You have a stimulus, a call and you go, a call and you go, a call and you go. And in the midst of it, you sort of lose the forest. All you see is trees and you are in between the trees, right? So you need the moment for reflection. If you don't have a reflective practice, if you don't reflect on what you're doing, you're gonna wear yourself out. And so you're going to wear yourself out because you don't process the environment and the context. Todd talked about, the same principle working in couples or working with, taking care of kids, with issues with kids or issues in marriages. And, I agree with you. It's very rarely, just one person's perspective. Things fail because we fail to notice, and because we fail to notice, we are in that vicious circle. So whether it is, with, behaviors of things that really get us. So acknowledging, labeling those emotions allows us to have that gap. And I call that model our stimulus gap response. You all agreed, you don't want to be reacting immediately to some people because you're going to say things that you later can't pull out, right? So that's part of that emotional agility, is to have a stimulus and allowing yourself a gap to process what happened, analyze it, reflect on it, and then think about how important is it going to be in 6 months' time. That's what I always do. Whenever I get, really down on something, there's an issue at work or a policy or something, I try to think about what kind of influence do I have on it? Because I can be concerned about it, but if I have no influence, then my whole effort goes into nothing. And then I try to think about what other factors are there. But the thing that I usually think about is, on a scale of 0 to 10, how bad is it? But then I think, how is it going to matter to me in 6 months' time? And usually, those things that won't matter in 6 months, I can let go, and I can resolve. I can resolve myself to not, dwell on them and not let them fester, because wherever you go in your careers, you're going to have to learn, which battle to win and which battle to let go. And so that reflection and, the way we think about things affects our behaviors. And so if we don't allow that time to think or reflect, then we repeat the same behaviors over and over again. And I think it's pretty clear to all of you that that's the case, but reflecting is really, really important. And so let's say you mentioned the thing about crisis or Harvey or responding, and you don't have time to think. But what do you do after? What does the organization do after? Do you have debriefs? Post-incident stress debriefings are so important. There is a ton of research that talked about well-being of people in organizations and differences between the people that participate in a high-impact event, a loss of life, the abuse of a child, somebody losing a home, somebody dying in the fire, pets, drowning in the flood. And you go through that and you deal with the public and citizens that deal with that. And it really erodes your mental health because, we're all the same. Nobody is, just because you have a badge doesn't mean you were born with a certain shield against mental anguish. So what happens after that? Do we get debriefed? Do we get, counseling? And I'm not talking about, this, stigma counseling of going to the shrink. I'm talking about talking to chaplains, talking in groups of employees who had similar experiences. Because if those things are not addressed in those environments, then later you have, you guessed it, you've got post-traumatic stress disorder. By the time you get to the PTSD, it's very difficult to get those employees back. So, and you see, cynicism. Cynicism is one of the first symptoms of PTSD. So, again, having the ability to reflect and debrief. After action debriefs after critical incidents are very, very important. And again, good leaders will make sure that those processes are in place. My husband, Mark, he did research on mental health checkups in police officers. And, it's really an amazing thing that, you get a gun, at least, in the United States and in Texas, you get a gun and you have to qualify with a gun once or twice a year, whatever the requirement is, because you need to be proficient with it. But you generally don't have any mental health evaluation after you get hired. You might get the psychological testing when you first get hired with the agency, and then over years and years and years. And, the most horrible decisions a lot of times are made with people that are high ranking, that have 20, 30 years. There are lieutenants, captains, assistant chiefs, you name it. And because there is no follow-up, and unless you have officers involved shooting, which usually is more structured debriefing process, there is really not any assessments or programs for other types of relief of stress. Is your workplace fun? Okay, ask yourself that. Should the police department, workplace, or emergency operations center, or fire station, or place that organizes relief, humanitarian relief, should they be fun places? Is there anything impossible about making a place fun to work in? And that's where the recovery happens as well. So then you move to the last section of your presentation, where you have to suggest, if you were hiring a newbie, a greenhorn in an office of an emergency operations center, an emergency management coordinator had to test for civility. What are some best strategies to tease it out of candidates versus, send us your resume, your test scores, and, another written test, and then, criminal procedures, or whatever it might be for a different workplace. And you had some good discussion around different ways of working on it. Putting somebody in a pressure cooker scenario. So, looking at how they will work under pressure, throwing things at them that are timed, seeing how they problem solve, not necessarily to see if they can solve that problem, but how they can deal with that pressure. Are they going to get frustrated? Are they going to get short? Are they going to get, nervous? Are they going to be defensive? Right. So that's a really, really good strategy to do scenarios. I think scenarios and simulations usually are a more in-depth assessment of people working in those, trying to demonstrate those soft skills. Evaluate critical thinking as well. Oral board, I think, Todd, you talked about the oral board, and the fact is that no matter what you do in the oral board is that you're never going to be right, but people want to see how you act, how you respond, how you process, whether you blurt something out without thinking about it, or whether you're going to say, well, I really don't know the answer to that, but I had an event that, or something, something to that effect. So sometimes they might not be looking for the perfect answer, right? Because nobody's excellent in everything, and any question can come up. But more and more often, those oral boards or assessment centers are looking at your ability to prioritize. Assessment center, for those of you that don't know, it's a very good method for hiring, or actually for promotions to the next level, so supervisory, managerial positions. And typically an assessment center, if it's organized by an agency, consists of so-called in-basket. And the in-basket exercise, what it usually has, it will have, like, they'll give you a calendar, a month calendar, 1 to 30, whatever, however many days in a month. And then they will tell you, okay, you are now a lieutenant, or you are now emergency management coordinator, or you're applying for, you're now in that position. And you have this civic group that needs to meet with you about this, educational outreach. The mayor calls you and they say they need you to fill in on that. In the meantime, you have a project with, a grant, UASC grant, that, you need to write a report on. In the meantime, you have a problem employee that requires counseling, but being numerous calls from HR about it. Then one of your employees takes a car home and they, do something personal, but, there needs to be the internal affairs involved in that. And then you also have the media inquiry about this last event. We have some requests from PIOs for release of information, and so on and so forth. And what you need to do is you have to prioritize those tasks. So like Todd said, prioritization is really critical in Homeland Security emergency management environments, because, no matter what you do, you have a critical incident, you have to have a priorities. What are you going to do first? What are you going to do next? What is less important, and what you can worry about 4 hours down the road? What are you going to do to contain? What do you want to do to save lives? And, what are those first actions? And very similar in organizing your portfolio later when you promote. Are you going to dwell on this one, media inquiry that is pestering you, whatever? Are you going to be able to delegate it? to somebody, but you're going to focus on what's really the most critical. It's usually something about, the public image, public relations, that might be detrimental to the organization if you don't solve it, or, some important political issues, or some very important service issues, community issues, meeting with community leaders and stuff like that. So those are really, really good ways, those oral boards and assessment centers, to work it out. And what else did you have? So I think those are pretty much the ones you discussed. So the scenarios, the tell me about the time or a situation in which you had to demonstrate that, and pressure, group pressure exercises, being in a setting of various individuals who may be looking at a candidate from a variety of different perspectives. A female might be having a different take. I've seen interviews where, a candidate for promotion was assessed by, let's say, 3 males, and they were saying, well, she's kind of soft-spoken, and, for incident command, you need somebody that's such, really projects the voice. But that was their value, and me as a female, I believe that, you don't have to scream during a briefing, and you don't have to be your voice projecting. You just have to have a good microphone. But if you're composed, if you're organized, if you have your maps, if you know how to greet people, how to welcome them. So I was looking at something totally different than they were looking at. So having more people that represent a wider portion of, different gender, different, more inclusive and diverse board is also very beneficial, because different people will look at different things, and you can eliminate the bias, and you can eliminate the favoritism, or you can eliminate some things that later could be issues, like, favoritism and stuff like that. So I enjoyed your discussion. I am looking forward to your next Hangout, and I hope you enjoy those as well.